In the final months of World War II, everything was coming apart at once. The German front was collapsing under constant pressure. Supply lines were shattered, and orders were confusing or non-existent. Amid the chaos, thousands of women who had been serving the war effort in non-combat roles suddenly found themselves on the move with no clear destination. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. Many had worked as radio operators, clerks, messengers, or anti-aircraft auxiliaries. Some had never fired a weapon. But when the retreat began, none of that mattered. They were swept up in mass surrenders alongside retreating units, moving westward through a landscape that no longer felt like a country, but a series of broken roads and ruined towns. The days blurred together as they marched. Food was scarce, sometimes non-existent. A handful of dried bread, a shared potato, whatever could be found along the way. Nights were spent wherever there was space. Abandoned barns, open fields, bombed-out buildings with no roofs left to keep out the cold. Many hadn't slept properly in weeks. Their bodies were exhausted, but their minds were even more strained. Every distant sound felt like danger. Every plane overhead sent them diving for cover, even when there was nowhere to hide. What weighed on them most wasn't just hunger or fatigue. It was fear. Deep, carefully cultivated fear. For years, they had been told exactly what would happen if they fell into American hands. Stories circulated endlessly through training units and barracks. Americans were violent, undisciplined, cruel. They would humiliate prisoners. They would harm women. They would take revenge. Whether these stories were exaggerated or completely fabricated didn't matter anymore. After months of bombardment and retreat, the line between truth and propaganda had vanished. So when word spread that American troops were close, panic took hold. Some women cried openly. Others clutched each other as they walked. A few refused to look up at all, keeping their eyes fixed on the ground as if eye contact alone could invite punishment. They braced themselves for shouting, for weapons raised, for rough hands and harsh orders. But when the moment finally came, it didn't look the way they had imagined. The Americans didn't rush them. They didn't scream commands. They didn't strike or threaten. Instead, they pointed, gestured, and directed the women toward shelter with clipped but calm instructions. The absence of violence was confusing, almost unsettling. The women obeyed, but their bodies remained tense, shoulders tight, hearts racing. Fear doesn't disappear just because nothing bad happens. It waits. It watches. Even as they were led away, even as the immediate danger seemed to pass, the fear stayed with them. They told themselves this was temporary. That the real treatment would come later. That kindness, if that's what this was, couldn't possibly last. They had learned not to trust it. Not yet. Once the initial shock of capture faded, the women began to notice something that didn't fit the story they had been told. This wasn't a prison camp in the way they had imagined it. It was temporary, improvised, and guarded. But it wasn't cruel. They were guided into basic shelters and enclosed areas where American troops maintained watch day and night. The guards were firm, alert, and professional, yet distant. No insults were shouted. No weapons were waved for intimidation. For women who had spent weeks bracing themselves for brutality, the calm felt unnatural. Blankets were issued first, simple and rough, but warm. Then came food. Not scraps or rations passed grudgingly through a fence, but full meals served on a regular schedule. Warm soup. Bread that wasn't moldy or stale. Sometimes even something sweet. The women ate quickly at first, barely speaking, half expecting someone to take the food away at any moment. Some hid pieces of bread in their sleeves or pockets, instinctively preparing for hunger to return. Hunger had trained them not to trust abundance. Processing followed, but it wasn't the ordeal they feared. Names were taken. Basic questions were asked. Medical checks were routine, not aggressive. When someone collapsed from exhaustion, medics stepped in without hesitation. Cuts were cleaned. Fevers were monitored. Dehydration was treated. No one shouted for them to stand faster or move quicker. The lack of punishment was almost more disturbing than cruelty would have been. It left too much space for uncertainty. Despite the respectful treatment, fear lingered in small, quiet ways. The women avoided eye contact with the guards. They whispered among themselves in low voices, careful not to be overheard. Every footstep outside the enclosure made them tense. Every door opening triggered a sharp intake of breath. Years of propaganda don't disappear overnight, especially not after months of trauma. Kindness felt like a trick. Something that would be withdrawn without warning. Rumors filled the gaps where certainty should have been. Some believed harsh interrogations were coming. Others thought they would be shipped off for forced labor. A few feared something even darker, fueled by the same stories they had grown up hearing. So when American soldiers approached, the women straightened their backs, prepared to endure whatever was next. But nothing changed. The guards remained controlled and distant. The medics continued their rounds. Meals continued to arrive, morning, midday, evening. The routine became predictable, and that predictability slowly chipped away at the tension. Not enough to create trust, but enough to allow a moment of breathing room. Time passed differently there. Without the constant noise of shelling or the frantic pace of retreat, the days felt oddly still. The women were assigned simple tasks. Cleaning areas, sorting supplies, helping prepare food under supervision. The work wasn't punishment. It was structure. Something to occupy hands and minds that had been locked in survival mode for too long. Still, they stayed guarded. They had learned that safety could vanish in an instant. They told themselves not to relax, not to believe this was real. And yet, beneath the caution, something unfamiliar was beginning to surface. Not relief. Not trust. But confusion. Confusion about why the enemy was acting this way. And what it meant if everything they had been taught might be wrong. By the time the camp settled into its routine, the tension had softened just enough for small details to stand out. People began noticing who struggled more than others. Who moved slowly, who avoided sitting or standing for too long. During one morning roll call, as the women gathered and tried to balance their weight on narrow wooden benches, an American medic noticed a young woman hesitating before she sat down. She lowered herself carefully, winced, stood again, and tried once more. The discomfort was obvious, even without a shared language. Eventually, she leaned toward the interpreter and spoke quietly, almost apologetically. "It hurts every time I sit." The words were simple, but the effect was immediate. The interpreter froze. A few nearby women shifted uncomfortably and looked away. The guards, who had learned to read tension quickly, exchanged cautious glances. No one said anything else. No one asked follow-up questions. The sentence hung in the air, heavy with implication. In a camp filled with rumors and half-formed fears, those words landed hard. They sounded like a warning. Like confirmation of something terrible that no one wanted to name out loud. The women had been conditioned to expect violence. And the silence that followed only made the imagination work harder. Even the Americans seemed unsure how to respond. No one wanted to accuse. No one wanted to misunderstand. And no one wanted to discover that their restraint had somehow failed. The medic waited until later, choosing a moment away from the group. He approached calmly, without an audience, and asked through the interpreter what had happened. The young woman hesitated. Her face flushed with embarrassment. And for a moment it seemed like she might withdraw the complaint altogether. Finally, she spoke again, this time more slowly. She explained that before the surrender, she and the others had barely eaten. Days of marching, sleeping in ruins, constant movement under fear of attack. Hunger had become a permanent ache, something her body had learned to ignore. Since arriving at the enclosure, everything had changed. 3 meals a day. Warm food. Enough to feel full for the first time in months. Her stomach, unused to it, felt heavy and swollen. sitting pressed against that fullness, and it hurt. There was a pause as the words sank in. Then the tension broke. The medic blinked, surprised. One of the guards let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. A few people laughed, not out of mockery, but out of relief. The sentence that had sounded so dark, so loaded, turned out to mean the exact opposite of what everyone feared. For the women listening nearby, the realization was just as powerful. That pain wasn't caused by cruelty. It was caused by care. By food. By safety. By the body's slow adjustment to not being starved anymore. In that moment, something shifted quietly through the camp. The danger they had been bracing for wasn't hidden in the routine. It wasn't waiting behind closed doors. The discomfort came from healing. The phrase spread, but now it carried a different weight. "It hurts every time I sit" became less of a warning and more of a strange marker of recovery. Proof that the world had changed, even if it still didn't feel entirely real. After that moment, the camp didn't suddenly transform into a place of joy or comfort. But something important had shifted. The women didn't cheer or celebrate. War was still raging elsewhere, and the future was still uncertain. But the edge of fear, the constant bracing for harm, began to loosen its grip. The realization settled in quietly. What they were experiencing wasn't a trap or a delay before punishment. It was simply what it looked like. They were being treated as human beings. That understanding changed how ordinary moments felt. Sitting down to eat no longer carried the same tension. A guard walking past didn't automatically mean danger. When medics stopped to check on someone, the women no longer turned away in shame or panic. Small exchanges began to happen. Brief nods, cautious glances, the faintest hints of gratitude that didn't require words. Trust didn't arrive all at once. It grew in fragments. For the first time in months, there was no need to run. No alarms in the distance. No frantic orders shouted in confusion. Nights were quiet enough that some of the women struggled to sleep. Not because of fear, but because their bodies weren't used to silence. Safety felt strange. Almost uncomfortable. They had spent so long surviving that simply existing without immediate danger felt unreal. The sentence that had once filled the camp with unease now carried a different meaning. "It hurts every time I sit" was no longer something to whisper about. It became a reminder of how deeply starvation and fear had shaped them. And how unexpected recovery could feel. Pain, in this case, wasn't a sign of abuse. It was evidence that the body was healing. Slowly catching up to a reality it hadn't known in a long time. For many of the women, this experience quietly rewrote everything they believed about the people guarding them. The enemy they had been warned about didn't match the men they saw every day. These soldiers didn't seek gratitude. They didn't make speeches. They didn't perform acts of kindness for recognition. They simply followed a routine that treated prisoners with dignity, consistency, and restraint. And that consistency mattered more than any single gesture. Years later, some of these women would remember this period not as a dramatic turning point, but as something subtler and more lasting. A moment when fear gave way to understanding. When propaganda cracked under the weight of lived experience. When they realized that war had lied to them in more ways than one. In that small enclosure, far from home and surrounded by uncertainty, the most surprising thing wasn't survival. It was humanity. Not loud, heroic humanity, but quiet, ordinary humanity. The kind that doesn't erase the horrors of war, but stands in contrast to them. The kind that changes how a person sees the world long after the fences are gone. Because sometimes the story we think we're hearing isn't the true one. Sometimes the most powerful twist doesn't come from violence or tragedy, but from compassion where none was expected. And for these women, that realization stayed with them long after the war itself had ended.